Have you ever held a bill in your hand, knowing there was no way you could pay it? Not wouldn't, but couldn't. Hold that feeling. You're about to meet someone who turned that moment into something nobody expected. April 14th, 1984. Harlan County, Kentucky. The sun hadn't cleared the ridgeline when Kenneth Harper pulled his 1971 Ford F-100 to the edge of his field and let the engine idle. His hands stayed on the wheel, weathered hands the kind that come from 43 years of mountain living and 30 of farming. He wasn't looking at the tobacco plants that needed tending, or the fence line that needed mending, or the creek cutting through the south end of his property. He was looking at a piece of paper on the passenger seat. A bill from the co-op down in Baxter, $312 for anhydrous ammonia, fertilizer, the kind every tobacco farmer in eastern Kentucky put down if they wanted a crop worth selling. Kenneth Harper, third-generation white tobacco farmer in Harlan County, owner of 11 acres of bottom land his father had signed over to him in 1977 with a handshake, and no paperwork, did not have $312. He had a truck paid off. He had equipment he owned outright. He had land with no liens, no mortgages, no banks holding paper on it. What he didn't have was cash. What he wasn't going to do was borrow it. Kenneth turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than it should have. He folded the bill in half, then in half again, slipped it into the chest pocket of his flannel shirt right over his heart, and stepped out into the cold morning air. His grandfather had cleared this field in 1921. His father George had planted it for 31 years. Kenneth had worked it since he was 9 years old, walking behind mules, so old they looked like they'd been carved from stone. The soil knew his family. The question was whether Kenneth knew the soil well enough to make it through a season without the chemicals everyone else depended on. The year 1984 in eastern Kentucky wasn't the same as 1984 in Louisville or Lexington. Out here in the tight hollows and creek bottom farms of Harlan County, time moved differently. The roads were mostly two-lane. The nearest John Deere dealer sat 40 miles away in Pineville. The farm credit crisis, quietly destroying family operations across the Midwest, had already whispered its way into these mountains, and the whisper had teeth. Interest rates had climbed so high in the early 80s that farmers were paying 18, sometimes 19% on operating loans. Not a typo, 18%. Kenneth had watched men he'd known his whole life lose everything to numbers on paper that doubled faster than crops could grow. He'd seen good land sold at auction because someone took out $4,500 and 3 years later owed $9,000. He'd been careful. No loans he couldn't pay, no debts that would outlive a bad season. But being careful didn't mean having money. It just meant owing it to fewer people. The co-op had raised fertilizer prices 3 times in 2 years. The tobacco allotment system capped how much acreage he could plant. A late frost in March of 1983 had wiped out his first planting entirely, forcing him to start over in May with seed he'd borrowed from his cousin Paul Bennett over in Lynch. That lost time meant lost yield, which meant thin finances, which meant when the bill for anhydrous ammonia came in at $312, Kenneth Harper didn't have it, not without going to the bank. And he wasn't going to the bank. What Kenneth did next, most farmers would have called it crazy, but desperation and memory sometimes make strange partners. What he had instead was a piece of information, something his father had told him once, sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, the kind of thing you half hear and then forget for 20 years until suddenly you need it. George Harper had died in 1980 of a heart attack while stacking firewood. He was 60 years old. It was the kind of death that fit him useful until the last moment. George had farmed these same 11 acres from 1949 to 1980, and before the co-op existed, before anhydrous ammonia was even available in this part of Kentucky, he'd fertilized his fields the way his father before him had. Green manure, legume cover crops turned under in spring, clover mostly, sometimes hairy vetch. George had also used a field cultivator, an old case implement that had belonged to a man named Hatfield who lived up the hollow. Hatfield had sold it in 1948 for $12 when he gave up farming and moved to Covington to work at a factory. George had bought it, used it for more than a decade, and then set it aside when synthetic fertilizer became the easier path. That case cultivator had been sitting in the back of Kenneth's barn since 1961. 23 years. Kenneth knew it was there. He'd walked past it thousands of times. He'd stacked hay bales against it. He'd hung his lantern from one of its rusted tines. He'd never once thought of it as useful. Until now. The memory came back sharp that morning as Kenneth stood at the field's edge. Summer of 1976. He'd been 35 working the field while George sat on the porch watching, late afternoon light slanting through the trees. George had mentioned something about the old ways, about clover and cultivation, about how the ground could feed itself if you let it, if you worked it right, if you had patience. Kenneth had been half listening his mind on other things, a broken pump, a fence that needed posts, the 1,000 small emergencies that make up a farming life. 8 years later, standing in the cold April morning with a bill he couldn't pay, every word came back clear as creek water. But what Kenneth didn't know yet, what nobody in Harlan County knew, was that the answer to his $312 problem had been sitting in his barn for 23 years, covered in rust and waiting. Kenneth walked to the barn. The morning light cut through gaps in the board siding, throwing bars of gold across the dirt floor. The smell was familiar old hay, motor oil, earth thyme. In the back corner behind a stack of fence posts, and beneath a tarp, gray with dust, the case cultivator waited. Kenneth pulled the tarp free. Dust rose in clouds. The machine underneath looked more like archaeological evidence than working equipment. A 1947 case field cultivator, 7-foot working width, 12 curved steel shanks called tines or sweeps that were designed to reach down into the soil, breaking up compaction, incorporating residue, aerating the ground. No engine, no electronics, no hydraulic system, just steel and bolts and leverage and weight. You hooked it to a tractor, you dragged it through the field, and it did its work the way good tools always do, quietly without complaint. This one hadn't done any work in 23 years. Kenneth crouched beside it. 4 of the 12 shanks were seized tight with rust, frozen in their brackets like they'd been welded there. The main frame had an 8-inch crack running along one of the bars. Not structural, he decided, after running his thumb along it, but worth watching. 6 of the sweeps, the curved blades at the bottom of the shanks, were worn down past useful thin as dinner knives. The rest still had edge to them. The hitch pin was missing entirely. Kenneth stood in the barn for a long time, looking at this pile of rust and intention. He thought about what it would take. Time, the right bolts, maybe a welder, replacement sweeps, which he could get from the farm supply in Cumberland if they had them, which wasn't guaranteed. He figured the whole job would cost him $40 or $50 in parts, maybe 60, not 312. He went and got his toolbox. If he couldn't buy nitrogen to put into the ground, maybe he could work the ground differently. Turn under the clover that had volunteered along the fence rows, mix in the composted matter from the previous season, aerate the soil enough that whatever nitrogen was already there became more available to the roots. It wasn't a perfect solution. The old-timers had understood that legumes and cultivation were slow medicine, not fast fixes. It would take more than one season to build back what modern fertilizer delivered in a single application. But Kenneth didn't have $312, and he did have a rusted cultivator in his barn. The question became whether he could get it running. That evening, Margaret Harper set the table for 4. She was 40 years old, with auburn hair, going gray at the temples, and the kind of quiet strength that came from 20 years of marriage to a stubborn man farming difficult land. She worked check out at the Piggly Wiggly on Tuesdays and Thursdays, bringing home enough to cover groceries and little else. She'd seen the bill from the co-op that morning. It had been sitting on the kitchen table when she came in from hanging laundry. She hadn't said anything about it. Kenneth came in from the barn after dark, his hands black with grease. Their sons were already at the table. Jacob, 17, tall and serious, with his father's build and his mother's careful eyes. Ryan, 14, stocky and curious, still young enough to ask questions nobody wanted to answer. They ate in near silence. Pork chops and green beans and potatoes, the kind of meal that filled you up without costing much. Halfway through, Ryan broke the quiet. "What were you doing in the barn all afternoon, fixing something?" Ryan waited for more. When it didn't come, he pressed. "Fixing what?" Kenneth set down his fork. "An old cultivator, thinking I might use it this spring." Margaret's eyes met his across the table. A whole conversation happened in that glance. She knew about the bill. She knew what this meant. She didn't say a word. Jacob spoke up, then his voice careful. "You're not putting down ammonia this year." "Nope." The silence that followed felt heavier than the one before. Ryan looked confused. Jacob looked worried. Margaret looked at her plate. After dinner, Kenneth went back to the barn. Margaret brought him coffee, an hour later, steaming in a chipped mug. She stood in the doorway watching him work the lantern light, throwing shadows across his face as he tried to free a seized bolt with liquid wrench and patience. "I saw the bill on the table." Kenneth didn't look up. "I know. You're not going to the bank." It wasn't a question. Margaret had been married to this man long enough to know how he thought, how pride worked in him like a second skeleton, holding him upright when everything else wanted to bend. "I'm not going to the bank." She nodded once. "All right, then." She set the coffee on a hay bale and left him to his work. What Margaret understood, what she'd learned over 20 years, was that some men needed to find their own solutions, that offering help they hadn't asked for could feel like judgment, that the best thing she could do right now was trust him. So she did. Kenneth worked until midnight that first night. He got one bolt free with a combination of penetrating oil and a 3-foot length of pipe used as a cheater bar. When it finally let go, the sound echoed through the barn like a gunshot. 1 down, 11 to go. The next morning, Kenneth was back in the barn before sunrise. The work had a rhythm to it. Apply liquid wrench. Wait. Apply pressure. Wait longer. Sometimes the bolt surrendered. Sometimes it didn't. The ones that refused, he'd have to drill out and tap new threads, a process that could eat 6 hours for a single fastener. By the end of the first week, he'd freed 6 of the 12 shanks. Jacob and Ryan started helping in the evenings. Ryan held the flashlight, learning to angle it where his father's hands worked without being told. Jacob handed tools, watching the process, understanding that what they were doing was more than mechanical repair. They were salvaging something that had been given up for dead. Kenneth drove to Cumberland on Saturday morning, 40 miles each way on two-lane roads that wound through hills where spring was just starting to green the trees. The farm supply sat on the edge of town, a long metal building with a gravel lot. Inside smelled like feed and fertilizer and rubber. The man behind the counter was maybe 60, wearing overalls and a company cap. Kenneth told him what he needed: 8 replacement sweeps for a 1947 Case-Field cultivator. The man's eyebrows went up. "Haven't sold those in years. Let me check the back." He was gone 15 minutes. When he returned, he had 8 sweeps in his hands, still in their original packaging, the cardboard yellowed with age. "Found these in the old inventory. Been here longer than I have." "How much?" $37. Kenneth paid in cash. The bills were worn soft, pulled from a coffee can in the back of a kitchen cabinet where Margaret kept emergency money. The man bagged the sweeps and looked at Kenneth with something like curiosity. "What you working on 1947 Case?" The man nodded slowly. "Well, I'll be. Didn't know there were any of those still running. This one isn't. Yet." Kenneth drove home with the sweeps on the passenger seat, his mind already on the next problem: the frame crack. That would need welding, and Kenneth didn't have the equipment for it, but he knew someone who did. Edward Caldwell lived 2 hollows over at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. He was 68 years old and had been welding since before Kenneth was born. His shop was a pole barn with 3 walls and a roof open to the weather on one side. The air inside smelled like acetylene and hot metal. Kenneth found him working on a hay baler, sparks cascading from his torch in bright waterfalls. When the work stopped, Kenneth explained what he needed. Caldwell pulled off his welding hood and looked at the cracked frame section Kenneth had brought. "Your daddy would approve of this. He always said the new ways make men lazy." "What do I owe you?" Caldwell considered. $8 and a jar of Margaret's apple butter, if she's still making it. "She is." "Then we got a deal." Caldwell welded the crack properly, running a bead along both sides of the fracture, reinforcing it with a piece of flat bar steel. When it cooled, it was stronger than the original. Kenneth paid him the $8 and promised the apple butter. Caldwell nodded toward the frame section. "This for that old Case cultivator your daddy used to run. That's the one." Caldwell set down his torch. "I remember when Hatfield sold that to your father, 1948. $12. George got a good deal. Hatfield was done with farming, wanted city work. Seems like everyone did eventually. Not everyone. You're still here." Kenneth picked up the frame section, testing the weld with his thumb. "I'm still here." The hitch pin Kenneth made himself. A bolt, some washers, a cotter key. It wasn't factory. It was better. It fit the implement and the tractor exactly, with no slop, no play. The kind of thing you make when you can't afford to buy it and won't accept less than it needs to be. By the middle of the 3rd week, the cultivator was coming together. All 12 shanks were operational. 8 new sweeps installed, 4 original ones still usable. The frame welded solid. Every bolt that could be freed had been freed. Every worn part that could be replaced had been replaced. Kenneth stood back and looked at it. The machine was still old, still showed its age in 100 small ways, scratches, dents, discoloration where rust had been cleaned off, but it was functional. ready to work. What he had now was a gamble, a bet that the ground could give him what a bag of chemicals would have given him. That clover turned under and soil worked properly could release enough nitrogen to carry a crop through, that the old ways his father had known and he'd forgotten were still true. It was slower than he wanted, less certain than he liked. If he was being honest with himself, it was more prayer than plan. But it was free, and it was his, and it worked from what the land already had, not from what someone else was willing to sell you. Kenneth had 3 weeks before planting season closed, 3 weeks to bring back something that hadn't moved in 23 years. On the evening of May 2nd, Margaret brought sandwiches out to the barn. Kenneth sat on a hay bale, eating while his sons cleaned tools. The cultivator stood in the center of the floor, ready. Tomorrow morning, Kenneth would back out the 1965 Oliver 550 Tractor 40 horsepower orange as a pumpkin loud as a freight train and hitch this implement to it, and find out if memory and rust and faith could substitute for $312. Ryan looked at the cultivator. "You really think this'll work?" Kenneth chewed his sandwich, swallowed. "Don't know. Going to find out. What if it doesn't? Then we'll be having a thin year." Margaret spoke up, then her voice quiet but firm. "We've had thin years before." Kenneth looked at his wife. She met his eyes with that steady gaze he'd first fallen for 22 years ago. No fear in it, no doubt, just the kind of practical faith that meant more than any sermon. Jacob stood up, brushing dirt off his jeans. "I'll help you hook it up in the morning." "Me too," Ryan added. Kenneth nodded. "All right then." That night Kenneth lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Margaret beside him, her breathing deep and even. Down the hall the boys in their rooms. Outside the creek running low this time of year, a sound like whispered conversation. He thought about his father, about George Harper sitting on that porch in 1976, talking about the old ways, about how the ground could feed itself if you let it, how cultivation wasn't just about breaking dirt, but about creating conditions, about patience being its own kind of skill. George had known things Kenneth was only now beginning to remember, had understood that the modern world's solutions came with prices that weren't always printed on the bill. That debt had a weight to it, a gravity that pulled you down even when you made every payment on time. Kenneth had watched good men in this county get swallowed by that gravity, had seen farms auctioned, families' broken pride ground down to dust under the heel of compounding interest. He'd made his choice. No bank, no debt, no $312 he didn't have. Instead, he had rust transformed into function. Old knowledge pulled from the back of memory, a machine that had waited 23 years for someone to need it badly enough. Tomorrow morning, the real test would begin. Kenneth closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, but it came. In the barn, the case cultivator stood ready in the darkness. 12 shanks, 8 new sweeps, 1 homemade hitch pin, 68 years old, counting from the year it was manufactured. 23 years since it had last moved under its own weight, or anyone else's. But what Kenneth didn't know yet, what nobody in Harlan County knew, was that fixing the machine was the easy part. Next, Kenneth had to face something harder than seized bolts or worn steel. He had to face his neighbor's judgment. And in eastern Kentucky, in the spring of 1984, that judgment was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. Part 1 complete. Word count 3,542. Target 5,500 to 6,200. Status under target. continuing. Kenneth woke before dawn on May 3rd. The sky through the bedroom window showed the first gray light of morning, that thin color that comes before the sun decides whether the day will be clear or clouded. He dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Margaret, and went downstairs. The kitchen was cold. He started coffee on the stove, the old percolator that had belonged to his mother, and stood at the window looking out toward the barn while the water heated. Somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, a whippoorwill called. The sound carried across the hollow, lonely and insistent. By the time the coffee was ready, Jacob had come downstairs. The boy moved quietly, pulling on his work boots by the door. He poured himself a cup without asking a small adulthood that Kenneth noticed without commenting on. "Ready?" Kenneth nodded. "Let's see if she starts." They walked to the barn together, coffee steaming in their hands. The air smelled like wet earth and coming rain, though the sky showed no immediate threat. The Oliver 550 sat in its usual spot, patient as a draft horse. Kenneth had bought it used in 1972 for $800, and in the 12 years since, it had never failed to start, until this morning. Kenneth turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. He tried again. Same result. A third time, nothing but a grinding sound that spoke of battery or starter or something in between that chose this particular morning to quit. Jacob set down his coffee. "Want me to get the jumper cables? Won't help if it's the starter." They popped the hood. In the growing light, Kenneth checked connections, wiggled wires, looked for the obvious failure. Everything appeared sound. He tried the key again. The engine turned over twice and caught running rough for a moment before smoothing out into its familiar diesel growl. Kenneth let it warm up for 5 minutes, watching the temperature gauge climb. Whatever had caused the hesitation seemed to have resolved itself, though he didn't trust it to stay resolved. Machinery had a way of knowing when you needed it most and choosing those moments to remind you of its mortality. Jacob helped him back the tractor up to the cultivator. Hitching the implement took longer than it should have. The homemade pin didn't quite line up on the first 3 attempts. Kenneth had to adjust the tractor's position inch forward, inch back, until finally the pin slid home and the cotter key could be inserted. By the time they finished, the sun had cleared the ridge. Margaret stood on the porch with Ryan beside her. She'd wrapped a cardigan around her shoulders against the morning chill. She didn't wave or call out, just watched. Kenneth climbed back onto the tractor. Jacob stepped away from the hitch. The cultivator sat ready behind the Oliver, its 12 shanks pointed earthward like skeletal fingers. Kenneth engaged the power, takeoff set the throttle, and eased the clutch out. The tractor lurched forward. The cultivator followed its weight, pulling through the hitch. For a moment, Kenneth thought one of the shanks would break free, snap off, vindicate every doubt he'd carried through 3 weeks of restoration work. Then the tines bit into soil. The cultivator went through that bottomland like warm butter. 12 shanks working in concert, the tines flexing just right, loosening earth in a pattern George Harper would have recognized immediately. Kenneth could feel it through the tractor seat, that particular vibration. That meant the implement was doing what it was designed to do. Breaking compaction, incorporating residue, aerating ground that had spent a winter sealed tight. He made the first pass along the south edge, turned at the fence line, came back parallel. The cultivated strip behind him showed darker than the untouched soil, broken up and receptive. By the third pass, Kenneth allowed himself to believe it might actually work. The clover he'd planted in the fence rows back in early March had grown thick enough to mow. He'd spread it across the field the week before, letting it dry in the sun. Now the cultivator was turning it under working it into the soil, beginning the slow chemistry of decomposition and nitrogen release. That didn't come from a bag or a tank or a co-op bill. It took him 4 hours to finish the field. When he shut down the tractor, his hands were numb from vibration, and his back ached from the constant turning to check the implement's action. But the field behind him looked right, worked, ready for planting. Jacob had watched from the fence for the first hour, then disappeared. Now he came back carrying 2 glasses of water, ice clinking against the sides. Kenneth drank his straight down the cold, shocking his throat. "Looks good," Jacob said. "Looks like dirt. Better than it did this morning." Kenneth allowed that was true. He climbed down from the tractor, walked back along one of the cultivated rows. The soil felt loose under his boots, friable. He crouched and picked up a handful, let it run through his fingers. The clover pieces were visible in it, green threads already starting to break down. What he was doing was trusting processes that took time. Bacterial action, microbial breakdown, the slow release of nutrients locked in organic matter. It wasn't as immediate as synthetic ammonia pumped directly into root zones, but it was free. And if his father's memory served, it would work. If. That afternoon, Kenneth drove into town for tobacco seed. The co-op sat on the main road through Harlan, a low building with a gravel parking lot and a loading dock where farmers backed their trucks up for feed and fertilizer. Kenneth parked as far from the entrance as the lot allowed and walked in. The man behind the counter was Jerry Simmons, who'd worked the co-op for 15 years and knew every farmer in the county by name and credit line. He looked up when Kenneth entered. "Kenneth, haven't seen you in a while. Been busy, I noticed. Didn't see your name on the ammonia orders this month." Kenneth set a $20 bill on the counter. "Need 2 pounds of burley seed, the certified kind." Jerry reached under the counter for the seed, bagged it, made change. His movements were deliberate, like he was working up to something. Finally he said it. "You not fertilizing this year, doing it different. How's that old way? Cultivation and cover crops." Jerry was quiet for a moment. Then he handed over the change and the seed. "Your daddy used to do that, before my time here, but I heard about it. Figured it was worth trying again." Jerry nodded noncommittal. "Well, good luck with it." Kenneth took the seed and left. He could feel Jerry's eyes on his back all the way to the truck. By tomorrow, half the county would know Kenneth Harper wasn't buying fertilizer this year. By next week, they'd all have opinions about why. That evening, Donald Carson drove past Kenneth's field, slowed down, looked at the freshly cultivated soil, didn't stop. But Kenneth saw him from where he stood at the fence line, checking one of the posts that had started to lean. Donald owned 200 acres 3 miles up the road, commercial tobacco operation, new equipment, a line of credit at the Farm Credit Bank that ran into 5 figures. His 1982 Chevrolet Silverado stayed washed even in mud-season chrome, gleaming the truck bed empty of the tools and dirt that filled Kenneth's Ford. They'd known each other since boyhood, weren't enemies, weren't exactly friends either, shared a county and a crop and very little else. Kenneth watched the Silverado disappear around the bend. He knew what Donald was thinking, what everyone would think, that Kenneth Harper had finally run out of money, that the careful farming and debt-free living had caught up with him, that he'd be showing up at the bank soon enough, hat in hand, learning what the rest of them already knew about modern agriculture. They'd be watching, waiting to see what happened when old methods met current economics, waiting for the crop to come in, thin and pale, and prove them right. Kenneth drove the remaining posts into the fence line as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. The whippoorwill started up again, closer now. Across the hollow, a dog barked. The sounds of evening in eastern Kentucky, same as they'd been for 100 years. Inside the house, Margaret had supper ready. Chicken and dumplings, the kind that filled the kitchen with steam and the smell of comfort. They ate together, the four of them, and afterward Kenneth sat on the porch while Margaret did dishes and the boys finished homework. The stars came out one at a time, then in clusters, then all at once, in that way they do when you're far enough from city lights to see them properly. Kenneth sat in the chair his father had sat in, looking at the field he'd just cultivated with the implement his father had bought 46 years ago from a man who'd given up farming for factory work. The circle of it struck him. How tools outlasted men. How knowledge could skip generations and still be true. How what looked like progress sometimes turned out to be just expense wearing a different hat. $312. That's what it would have cost to do it the modern way, the easy way, the way that required no memory, no rust removal, no 3 weeks of evening work with seized bolts and replacement sweeps. Instead, Kenneth had spent $61.37 for sweeps, $8 for welding, $16 for miscellaneous bolts and hardware, $61 versus $312, and the difference was time, labor, stubborn refusal to accept that the only solution was the expensive one. His father would have understood. George Harper had lived through the Depression when making do wasn't a choice but a survival skill, when debt was something you avoided, like disease, because sometimes it was worse than disease, at least. Sickness eventually killed you or let you go. Debt could keep you half alive and suffering for decades. Kenneth had made his choice. Now came the part where he lived with it. Inside, Margaret turned off the kitchen light. The porch went darker by half. Kenneth stood, stretched, felt his back protest the day's work. 43 years old and already feeling 50. That's what farming did to a body, especially farming that didn't pay well enough for good equipment or hired help. Tomorrow, he'd plant. The next day, he'd start the waiting. Months of watching seedlings emerge, grow, show their true color. Months of knowing that what he'd done might not be enough, that the bet he'd made with rust and memory could still fail. But tonight the field was ready. The seed was bought. The cultivator that had waited 23 years in the barn had done its work and done it well. Kenneth went inside, locked the door, climbed the stairs to bed. In the barn, the case cultivator sat where he'd unhitched its soil, still clinging to its tines. 68 years old, 23 of those years spent idle. Now reborn into service by necessity and stubbornness, and a man who couldn't afford the alternative. The whippoorwill called one last time across the hollow, then silence, then the small sounds of night in the mountains, creek water over stones, wind through trees. The settling of old wood in an old house where a family slept, trusting that tomorrow would come and bring with it whatever it brought. Kenneth Harper, third-generation white tobacco farmer in Harlan County, Kentucky, owner of 11 acres and zero debt, slept the sleep of a man who'd made his choice and would stand by it, come what may. The planting took 3 days. Kenneth walked the rows with a hand seeder, the kind his grandfather had used, dropping burley seed into soil still loose from the cultivator's work. Each seed fell into earth that smelled different than it had in years past, less chemical, more alive. Whether that difference would matter come harvest time was the question Kenneth carried with him up and down those rows. Jacob helped the first day, walking parallel lines 20 feet apart, both of them counting steps to keep the spacing consistent. The boy had his mother's patience and his father's stubbornness, a combination that served him well in work that required both. By noon, Kenneth's back had started the familiar ache that came with repetitive bending. By evening, he could barely straighten up enough to walk to the house. Margaret had supper ready when they came in, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the meat tender enough to pull apart with a fork. She watched Kenneth lower himself into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had put in a full day's complaint. "You need to take a break tomorrow." "Can't. Weather's supposed to turn Wednesday. Then let Jacob finish. He knows what he's doing." Kenneth looked at his son. The boy met his eyes with a steady gaze that held no doubt, no hesitation, just the quiet competence of someone who'd been raised to understand that work got done whether it hurt or not. "All right. You finish the north section tomorrow. I'll check the irrigation lines." Jacob nodded once. The conversation was over. The weather turned on schedule. Wednesday brought clouds that threatened rain, but delivered only wind, the kind that dried out topsoil and worried farmers who'd just planted. Kenneth spent the morning checking the irrigation setup he'd cobbled together over the years, a centrifugal pump he'd bought at auction in 1979 for $60, connected to a web of pipes and hoses that drew water from E.T.E. Creek when the creek was running high enough. This time of year, the creek ran strong with snowmelt from higher elevations. But come July, it would drop to a trickle, and Kenneth would be hauling water in a trailer tank if the summer turned dry, which it usually did. By the end of the week, all 11 acres were planted. The field looked bare, except for the barely visible disturbance where seeds lay buried. Kenneth stood at the fence line on Friday evening, watching the wind push patterns across the dirt. In 2 weeks, if everything went right, he'd see the first shoots breaking surface. In 3 months, he'd know whether the gamble had paid off. Until then, he waited. Sunday after church, Paul Bennett stopped Kenneth in the parking lot. Paul was Kenneth's cousin on his mother's side, a lean man in his 50s who farmed 80 acres over in Lynch and had the weathered look of someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. He leaned against Kenneth's truck, arms crossed. "Heard you didn't buy ammonia this spring. Word travels, always does. What are you doing instead? Clover and cultivation, the way Dad used to." Paul was quiet for a moment, looking past Kenneth toward the hills. "Your daddy knew what he was doing, but that was 40 years ago. Things have changed. Soil's still soil, maybe. But buyers expect a certain yield these days. You come in light, they notice? I know." Paul pushed off from the truck. "Well, you need anything, you let me know. Appreciate it." Kenneth watched his cousin walk to his own truck, an older Ford with more rust than paint. Paul meant well. They all meant well. But meaning well didn't change the fact that Kenneth had made a choice that set him apart from standard practice, and in a community where farming was already hard enough. Being different was its own kind of risk. Margaret had been quiet in the truck on the way home. Now, halfway back to their hollow, she spoke up. "People are going to talk. Let them. It bothers the boys. Ryan asked me yesterday if we were going broke. What did you tell him? That we're doing fine. That his father knows what he's doing?" Kenneth glanced at her. "And you believe that?" She looked out the window at the passing hills, green with spring growth. "I believe you're doing what you think is right. That's enough for me." They drove the rest of the way in silence. Late May brought the first shoots. Kenneth walked the field every morning before the sun got high, looking for the tiny green points breaking through. They came up uneven at first, some rows showing strong, others barely visible. but they came up. That was what mattered. He was checking the south corner on a Thursday morning when he heard a truck coming up the gravel drive. Kenneth knew that sound before he saw the vehicle. A Chevy Silverado, the engine tuned better than it needed to be the exhaust note of someone who could afford to care about such things. Donald Carson parked near the barn and got out. He was wearing clean jeans and boots that hadn't seen mud in recent memory. His shirt was pressed. Kenneth's own clothes were covered in dirt from kneeling between rows, his hands stained green from handling seedlings. Donald walked over to where Kenneth stood at the field's edge. He looked at the emerging plants, then at Kenneth. "Heard you're doing something different this year." Kenneth waited. When Donald wanted to say something, he'd say it. No sense rushing him. "Heard you didn't buy fertilizer." "That true?" "It's true. What are you using instead?" "Turned under clover. Cultivated deep. Let the soil do the work." Donald's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. The look a man gets when he's deciding whether to speak his mind or keep it to himself. He chose to speak. "Kenneth, that's not going to give you what you need. Clover gives you maybe a third of the nitrogen you'd get from ammonia. Your crop's going to come in thin. The buyer's going to notice. Probably will." "Then what's the point?" Kenneth felt the question settle between them like a challenge thrown down. He could have explained about the $312, about the choice between debt and pride, about watching good men lose everything to interest rates that compounded faster than crops could grow. But Donald Carson, with his 200 acres and his farm credit line, wouldn't understand. Or worse, he'd understand perfectly and still think Kenneth was making a mistake. "The point is, I don't owe anybody $300. Donald opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the field again, at the uneven emergence of plants that already showed less vigor than chemically boosted crops. When he spoke again, his voice had that particular quality, not quite sympathy, not quite contempt, somewhere in the valley between. "Well, suit yourself." He walked back to his truck. Kenneth watched him leave the Silverado, kicking up dust on the gravel drive. The dust hung in the air long after the sound of the engine faded. That evening, Kenneth found Jacob in the barn, organizing tools that didn't need organizing. The boy had a way of working when something was bothering him, using physical motion to process thoughts he didn't have words for yet. "Saw Mr. Carson here this morning. He stopped by." "What did he want to tell me?" "I'm making a mistake." Jacob set down the wrench he'd been holding. "Are you?" Kenneth considered his answer, considered all the ways he could soften it, make it easier for his son to carry. Decided against it. "Won't know until October. But I'd rather make my own mistakes than pay interest on someone else's certainty." Jacob nodded slowly. "That's what I figured." They worked together in silence for a while, cleaning tools and coiling hoses and doing the kind of maintenance work that never ended on a farm. Outside, the light faded from gold to amber to the deep blue of mountain twilight. Somewhere down the hollow, a car started. A dog barked. The ordinary sounds of rural evening. Before they went to the house, Jacob spoke up again. "Mr. Carson drives a nice truck." "He does. Does he farm better than you?" Kenneth hung the last coil of hose on its hook. "Farm's bigger. Whether that makes it better depends on who's counting." June brought heat, the kind that settled into the hollows and didn't move, even at night. The tobacco plants grew but showed the strain. Kenneth could see it in the leaf color, a shade lighter than he wanted, the green not quite as deep as chemically fertilized plants would show by this stage. Not pale, not yellowed, but not thriving either. The irrigation schedule became critical. Kenneth ran the pump 3 times a week, moving the hoses section by section across the field. The work was mindless and exhausting, and by mid-month he'd lost 5 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. Ryan helped when he could, but school was still in session, and the boy had homework that couldn't be ignored. Margaret had picked up an extra shift at the Piggly Wiggly, trying to build up their cash reserves against the possibility that Kenneth's gamble wouldn't pay off. The extra money helped. The extra hours meant she came home tired and tired. People needed more from each other than anyone had time to give. One evening, Kenneth came in from the field to find her sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out in front of her. She looked up when he entered. "Electric's up $12 this month." Kenneth poured himself water from the tap. "We can handle that. Insurance comes due in July, $340. He set down the glass. "We'll have it, from where I'll figure something out." Margaret gathered the bills into a stack, creasing the edges with her thumb. "We always do, don't we? Figure something out." There was no accusation in her voice, but Kenneth heard the weight of it anyway. 20 years of figuring things out. 20 years of making ends meet when the ends kept getting farther apart. 20 years of choosing between what they needed and what they could afford and learning to live with the difference. He sat down across from her. "If this doesn't work, it'll work. You don't know that." "No," her voice quiet but firm. "I don't, but I know you. I know when you make a choice, you stick with it. So I'm sticking with it too." She stood up, took the bills to the drawer where they kept important papers, and started making supper. Kenneth stayed at the table, watching her move through the familiar motions, pulling out the cast iron skillet, lighting the stove, seasoning the pan before the meat went in. Motions she'd performed thousands of times in this kitchen, feeding a family on wages that barely covered groceries and a farm that barely broke even. He'd married her when he was 21, and she was 19, both of them too young to understand what they were signing up for. But she'd stayed. Through lean years and meager harvests and winters when the only heat came from a coal stove that needed feeding every 4 hours. She'd stayed because that's what people did in these mountains. They married and they stayed, and they made it work through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Kenneth stood up and came to her side, took the spatula from her hand and set it down, turned her to face him. "I am sorry." "For what?" "For all of it. For asking you to live on faith and stubbornness and not much else." Margaret looked at him with those steady eyes that had first caught his attention across the church social 22 years ago. "That's not asking, that's marriage." She kissed him once, quick and certain, then turned back to the stove. The moment passed. The meat went into the pan with a sizzle that filled the kitchen with the smell of supper, but the moment stayed with Kenneth. Stayed with him through the meal and the evening chores and the walk out to check the field one last time before bed. Stayed with him as he stood at the fence line, watching heat lightning flicker on the horizon, illuminating clouds that promised rain but wouldn't deliver until the storm decided it was ready. His father had told him once that farming was mostly faith. Faith that the ground would give back what you put into it. Faith that the weather would cooperate more than it didn't. Faith that markets would hold and prices would justify the labor, and somehow, at the end of the season, you'd have enough to start again. George Harper had farmed on that faith for 31 years, had raised a family on it, had died still believing it was true. Kenneth was betting his family's future that his father had been right. July proved him half wrong. The heat intensified. ETE Creek dropped to a trickle by the second week, forcing Kenneth to haul water in the trailer tank a job that took 6 hours a day and left him so exhausted that supper became a formality he often skipped in favor of sleep. The tobacco plants survived, but didn't flourish. The west corner started showing stress leaves going limp in the afternoon heat, recovering overnight, but looking worse each day. Kenneth walked those rows every evening, examining plants one by one, looking for the color that would tell him whether his experiment was working or failing. Tobacco color was something a man who'd grown it his whole life could read the way doctors read X-rays, subtle variations that spoke volumes about what was happening beneath the surface. What he saw didn't encourage him. The plants were growing, but they were smaller than they should be at this stage, lighter in color. The leaves lacked the deep green of nitrogen-rich plants, showed instead a medium tone that suggested they were getting by, but not thriving, not starving, not struggling, just not excelling. Kenneth knew what Donald Carson would say if he saw them, what every farmer in the county would say, that this was what happened when you tried to outsmart chemistry with folk wisdom, that the old ways were old for a reason, that progress meant something even if it came with a price tag. But Kenneth also knew that his plants showed no signs of the burning that sometimes happened with over-application of synthetic nitrogen, no leaf curl, no yellowing from chemical stress. They were clean, uniform, healthy within their limitations. The question was whether healthy but small would be enough. Donald drove by twice in July. Both times he slowed down at the field's edge. Both times Kenneth was visible, working irrigation, or walking rows, or doing one of the 100 tasks that filled farming days. Neither man waved, neither stopped. But Kenneth felt the judgment in those drive-bys, felt it the way you feel weather changing before the first raindrops fall. Donald was watching, waiting for Kenneth to fail. Or maybe, and this was the thought that bothered Kenneth more, waiting for Kenneth to succeed and prove that everything Donald had built on debt and credit lines was built on sand. Late July brought a visitor Kenneth didn't expect. Agent Thornton from the University of Kentucky Extension Office in Harlan showed up on a Wednesday morning, driving a state vehicle and carrying a clipboard. He was maybe 40, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, the kind of academic farmer who'd learned agriculture from books and still thought that mattered more than dirt under your fingernails. "Mr. Harper, I'm Robert Thornton, Extension Service." Kenneth shook his hand. "What can I do for you? Heard you're trying something different this year. Organic methods. Mind if I take a look?" Kenneth gestured toward the field. "Help yourself." Thornton walked the rows with Kenneth following at a distance. The agent stopped periodically to examine plants, making notes on his clipboard. He crouched down and dug his fingers into the soil, brought up a handful, let it run through his hand, stood up and walked to the next section. After 20 minutes, he came back to where Kenneth waited by the fence. "How long since you last applied synthetic fertilizer to this ground?" 4 years of full application. This year, none. What are you using instead? Red clover turned under in spring, hairy vetch as cover crop, deep cultivation with a field cultivator. That's it. Thornton made more notes. "Mind if I take some soil samples?" "Go ahead." The agent returned to his vehicle and came back with sampling tools. He took cores from 6 different locations across the field, bagged and labeled each one, stored them in a cooler in his trunk. When he finished, he stood talking with Kenneth for another 10 minutes, asking questions about cultivation, depth timing, the condition of the implements used. Finally, Thornton clicked his pen closed and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "I'll send these to the lab in Lexington. Results should be back in 2 weeks. Mind if I come back in a month to see how the crop's developing? Kenneth nodded. You're welcome any time. After Thornton left, Kenneth stood at the field's edge wondering what the soil samples would show, whether the organic matter content would be measurably different, whether the slow way he'd chosen would show up in laboratory numbers or only in harvest yields. The answer came faster than expected. Thornton returned 10 days later with a manila folder containing lab results. They sat at Kenneth's kitchen table while Margaret poured coffee and the agent spread out printouts covered in numbers and graphs. Your organic matter content is up 0.7% from the county average for similar soil types. Kenneth studied the numbers. Is that significant? At this stage, it's notable. Organic matter affects water retention, nutrient availability, soil structure. 0.7% doesn't sound like much, but it represents a real change in the soil biology. Thornton pointed to another section of the printout. Your nitrogen levels are lower than you'd get with synthetic application. No surprise there. But they're not as low as I expected. The mineralization from the clover is working. It's just working slowly. How slowly? The agent leaned back in his chair. If you keep this up, clover vetch deep cultivation, you'll build organic matter year over year. Each year, the mineralization will release more nitrogen because there's more organic matter to mineralize. It's not a one-season fix. It's a 3 to 5 year transformation. Kenneth absorbed that. 3 to 5 years, 3 to 5 harvests, 3 to 5 seasons of yields that might come in below standard while the soil rebuilt itself into something self-sustaining. What you're doing, Thornton continued, is essentially trusting biological processes instead of chemical inputs. The biology works. It just works on its own timeline. After Thornton left, Kenneth sat at the table, staring at the printouts. Margaret came and sat across from him. What does it mean? Means it's working, just not fast. Is that good enough? Kenneth folded the papers and slid them back into the folder. Won't know until harvest. August came with no break in the heat. Kenneth walked his rows every evening, reading the plants like text written in gradations of green. They'd reached the stage where color told the whole story, whether they'd gotten enough nitrogen, enough water, enough of everything they needed to produce leaves worth buying. What he saw was plants doing their best with what they had, not thriving, not failing, somewhere in between, in that honest middle ground where most of life happened for most people. One evening, Margaret walked the rows with him. She didn't ask questions, just walked beside him while he examined plants and tried to calculate whether the gamble had been worth it. They reached the end of one row and turned back along the next. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that wouldn't last long enough to photograph. The air smelled like dust and growing things, and the particular scent of tobacco in late summer, sweet and slightly bitter, the smell of potential. It won't be a great year, Kenneth's voice quiet in the stillness. Margaret took his hand, but it'll be a year. They walked back to the house together as darkness settled into the hollow. Behind them, the field held 11 acres of tobacco plants that would never win any prizes for vigor or size, but would, if fortune held, be clean and uniform and saleable. And Kenneth Harper would owe nobody a single dollar for the privilege of growing them. That night, lying in bed with Margaret asleep beside him, Kenneth thought about what Thornton had said. 3 to 5 years, 3 to 5 seasons of building something that would eventually sustain itself, of trusting processes that worked on timelines longer than quarterly profits or annual harvests. His father had known this. George Harper had understood that the ground was a living thing, not a medium to be chemically manipulated, but a system to be worked with. That patience was its own kind of investment, paying dividends in soil health and crop resilience that showed up slowly but compounded over time. Kenneth had forgotten that, or maybe he'd never fully learned it, having grown up in an era when synthetic fertilizers made the old knowledge seem quaint and unnecessary, when speed and convenience justified any cost, including dependence on inputs you had to purchase year after year after year. Now lying in darkness with the sounds of night filtering through the window, Kenneth understood what his father had been trying to tell him on that porch in 1976, that farming wasn't about conquering the land. It was about partnering with it, about understanding that the best yields came not from force, but from cooperation. The crop would be what it would be. Kenneth had done everything he could, used the knowledge his father had given him, trusted the machine his father had bought, worked the ground the way his father had taught him, even if Kenneth hadn't been listening carefully enough at the time. Now he waited for October to arrive and deliver its verdict. In the barn, the Case cultivator sat cleaned and maintained, ready for fall use, 68 years old, and still functional, still capable of doing the work it was designed for if someone cared enough to use it, just like the knowledge George Harper had passed down, just like the faith Margaret showed every day, just like the stubborn refusal to accept that the only way forward was the expensive way, the debt-laden way, the way that everyone else had chosen. Kenneth closed his eyes and let sleep come. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, another day of waiting, another day of believing that what he'd chosen was right, even when the evidence remained uncertain. And in the field, 11 acres of tobacco plants grew under stars that had watched this valley for millennia, indifferent to human worry, patient as the soil itself. Final word count, 4,947. Target range, 6,000 to 7,000. Status, continuing. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints that summer's grip was loosening. The tobacco plants reached their full height, such as it was. Kenneth could walk between the rows now without bending the leaves, reaching chest-high instead of the shoulder-high he'd seen in better years. But the color had improved in the last weeks. The lighter green had deepened slightly, suggesting the slow-release nitrogen from composted clover was finally reaching the root systems in meaningful amounts. Ryan started back to school, catching the bus at 6:30 each morning for the 40-minute ride to Harlan County High. Jacob had graduated in June and was working full-time on the farm, now his college plans postponed by unspoken agreement that the family needed his labor more than he needed a degree. Kenneth hadn't asked him to stay. The boy had simply never filled out the applications that sat on his dresser, and eventually Margaret had moved them to a drawer where they wouldn't be a daily reminder of what wasn't happening. The work shifted from growing to preparation. Kenneth and Jacob spent mornings repairing the tobacco barn, replacing boards that had rotted over winter, checking the ventilation system, making sure everything was ready for the cutting and housing that would come in October. The barn was old, built by Kenneth's grandfather in 1923, and every year it needed more attention just to stay functional. They were working on the south wall when Donald Carson's Silverado pulled up the drive again. Kenneth saw it coming and didn't stop hammering. Let Donald wait. Donald got out and walked over to where they worked. He stood watching for a minute before speaking, looking better than I expected. Kenneth drove another nail before answering. Still light. But uniform. No disease I can see. Kenneth climbed down from the ladder. No, it's clean. Donald nodded toward the field. You're going to cut next month. Probably second week. Depends on weather. There was something different in Donald's posture, something less certain than his previous visits. He shifted his weight, looked at the ground, looked back at Kenneth. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. How much are you into this crop? Total cost. Kenneth considered whether to answer. Decided there was no harm in honesty. Seed was $20. Sweeps and parts for the cultivator ran about $60. Fuel and maintenance maybe $40. Call it $120, give or take. Donald was quiet for a long moment. I'm carrying $15,000 in operating costs for this season. Fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, equipment payments. $15,000 before I cut a single plant. Kenneth waited. When Donald wanted to say something, he'd say it. You know what the interest on that is? At 18%, Kenneth knew. Had watched other men calculate those same numbers, had seen the arithmetic of debt compound until it swallowed everything. $2,700, just the interest. Donald's voice had gone flat factual. That's due whether the crop comes in good or not, whether prices hold or not. Due on January 1st, regardless. He looked at Kenneth with something that might have been envy, or might have been respect, or might have been the dawning realization that bigger wasn't always better. You're going to net more per acre than I am, even if your yield's half of mine, because you don't owe anybody anything. Kenneth set down his hammer. I won't net much, but what I net is mine. Donald nodded slowly like a man accepting a truth he'd been avoiding. He turned to go, then stopped. Your daddy tried to tell me this once. Long time ago. I didn't listen. He walked back to his truck and left without another word. Jacob had stopped working to listen. Now he picked up his hammer again, but didn't immediately start using it. Is that true? About netting more? Kenneth shrugged. Won't know until the crop sells, but the math is what it is. When you owe interest on borrowed money, you're working for the bank before you're working for yourself. How much does Mr. Carson farm? 200 acres. And he's in debt, deep enough to feel it. Jacob hammered in silence for a while. Then I'm glad we're not him. Kenneth climbed back up the ladder. Me too. The days shortened. The light changed, taking on the golden quality that came in early autumn when the sun dropped lower in the sky. Kenneth walked the field every evening, checking plants for the signs that would tell him when to cut. Tobacco had to be harvested at the right moment too early, and the leaves hadn't reached full maturity too late, and they'd start deteriorating. The window was maybe 2 weeks wide, and timing it right meant the difference between a good cure and a poor one. By the end of September, the plants were ready. The leaves had that particular feel when you touched them, thick, slightly waxy, with a weight that spoke of substance. The color had settled into a medium green that was lighter than Kenneth would have liked, but darker than he'd feared. Clean, uniform, honest. On the last day of September, Margaret brought supper out to the porch, where Kenneth sat watching the sun drop behind the ridge. They ate together in silence, the way married people do when words have become less necessary than presence. You're going to cut this week. It wasn't a question, but Kenneth answered anyway. Wednesday, if the weather holds. I'll take the day off work, help with the housing. He looked at her. You don't need to do that. I know. I want to. They finished eating as the stars came out, one by one at first, then in clusters, then in such numbers that the sky became more light than dark. Kenneth had grown up under these stars, had worked his whole life beneath them, would probably die, having never lived anywhere else. There was something both limiting and comforting in that certainty. Margaret collected the plates and went inside. Kenneth stayed on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the hollow. A dog barking 3 houses down, the creek running low over stones, the rustle of wind through trees that were just starting to turn color. In 2 weeks, he'd know the answer to the question he'd been carrying since April, whether faith and memory and a rusted cultivator could substitute for $312. Whether the old ways his father had known still held true in a world that had moved on to faster, easier, more expensive solutions. Whether Kenneth Harper had made the right choice or simply the stubborn one, and whether there was any difference between the two. He stood up and went inside. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it the work that never ended but somehow always got done, one season at a time, one decision at a time, one day of choosing to owe nothing over the convenience of owing everything. The cutting started Wednesday morning with fog thick enough that Kenneth couldn't see the far end of the field from the barn. By 7, the sun had burned through enough to work, and he and Jacob went into the rows with tobacco knives, curved blades, designed to cut the stalk at ground level in one clean stroke. The work required a rhythm. Bend cut, lay the stalk across your shoulder, 4 stalks to a bundle. Carry the bundle to the wagon, return for more. Kenneth had been doing this since he was 10 years old, and his body moved through the motions with muscle memory that didn't require thought. Which was good, because his mind was elsewhere, on the leaves, on their color and weight and whether they'd cure properly in the barn, on the fact that he'd gotten this far planted, grown, maintained, and now faced the final test of whether his gamble had produced something worth selling. Margaret arrived mid-morning with water and sandwiches. She'd taken the day off from the Piggly Wiggly, and now she worked alongside them, gathering the cut stalks and loading them onto the wagon Kenneth would pull to the barn with the tractor. Her hands moved efficiently, no wasted motion, the practiced ease of someone who'd done this work before, even if not recently. Timothy, her brother, showed up after lunch. He was 45, worked construction in Harlan, and had arms thick enough to carry twice as many stalks as anyone else. He didn't ask questions about the crop or Kenneth's methods, just started working, and by mid-afternoon they'd cut and loaded half the field. The housing hanging the tobacco in the barn to cure took longer. Each stalk had to be spaced correctly to allow air circulation. Too close and they'd mold. Too far apart and they wasted barn space. Kenneth had rigged a pulley system years ago that made the work easier, but not easy. Jacob and Timothy worked the rafters while Kenneth and Margaret handed up stalks from the wagon. By sunset, the barn was half full and smelled like fresh-cut tobacco, a green, slightly bitter scent that would transform over the coming weeks into something darker and sweeter as the leaves cured. Kenneth stood in the barn doorway, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Behind him, the suspended stalks hung in even rows, waiting for time and ventilation to do their work. Margaret came and stood beside him. Her hands were blistered from the day's labor, and she held them carefully at her sides. "How does it look?" Kenneth considered the question. The honest answer was, he didn't know yet. Wouldn't know until the leaves finished curing and he could properly assess their quality. But Margaret wasn't asking for technical analysis. She was asking whether he thought they'd be all right. "It looks like we did everything we could," she nodded, accepting that as answer enough. They walked back to the house together through darkness that smelled like autumn and wood smoke, and the particular scent of these mountains in October, dry leaves and cold air, and the promise of winter coming. The second week of cutting went faster. Kenneth and Jacob worked alone most days, Timothy having returned to his construction job. By the 15th of October, the entire crop was cut and housed. Kenneth walked through the barn each evening, checking the cure, adjusting ventilation shutters, monitoring for any signs of mold or uneven drying. The leaves darkened as they cured, turning from green to yellow-brown to the deep tobacco color buyers looked for. Kenneth could read the cure in the way the leaves felt when he touched them. The gradual loss of moisture, the concentration of oils, the chemical transformation from living plant to marketable product. Some years the cure went wrong. Too much humidity and the leaves molded. Too little and they dried too fast, becoming brittle and worthless. This year the weather cooperated. Cool nights, mild days, enough air movement to keep things dry without over-drying. By early November, the tobacco was ready for market. Kenneth loaded the truck on a Monday morning, carrying out bundles of cured leaf and stacking them carefully in the bed. The tobacco had weight to it, now the leaves compressed and oily. He could smell them, that deep, almost sweet scent that meant proper curing. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. The tobacco market in Harlan operated out of a warehouse on the south end of town. Kenneth had been bringing his crop there for 23 years, and the routine never changed. Drive up to the loading dock, unload onto pallets, wait while the buyer inspected your lot. Hear the verdict, take the check, or go home empty-handed if the quality didn't meet standards. Mr. Dillard had been buying tobacco in Harlan County for 19 years. He was maybe 65, wore suspenders and a white shirt regardless of weather, and had the kind of face that gave nothing away until he wanted it to. He'd seen every trick, every attempt to pass off inferior leaf as premium, every farmer's hope that this year would be different. Kenneth waited while Dillard walked his lot. The buyer moved slowly, deliberately, picking up bundles and turning them in the warehouse light, separating leaves, holding them up, running his fingers along the veins to check texture. The silence stretched long enough that Kenneth's hands started to sweat despite the November cold. Finally, Dillard set down the last bundle and turned to Kenneth. "Crop is light." Kenneth's stomach dropped. He'd known it would be, had seen it in the field, but hearing it confirmed felt different than knowing it himself. Dillard picked up another bundle, examined it more closely. Color is good, though, even throughout. No blotching. He separated several leaves, held them to the light, streaming through the warehouse windows. "It's clean. No disease. No damage. No mold?" Kenneth waited. The verdict would come in the next words, and everything he'd worked for since April depended on what those words would be. Clean tobacco sells regardless of weight. You know that. Dillard walked back to his desk, made some notes on a form, did calculations that took longer than Kenneth's nerves could comfortably handle. When the buyer looked up, his expression hadn't changed. 81 cents a pound. The number landed like a physical thing, 81 cents. The county average this year was 84. Kenneth was 3 cents below. He did the math in his head. His crop weighed lighter than usual, maybe 2/3 of a normal year's yield. At 81 cents instead of 84, he was losing money on both ends. But he was losing less than he would have owed. Dillard wrote out the check. Kenneth took it without looking at the amount, walked back to his truck, sat in the cab with the engine off and the check in his hand. $940, net after accounting for the $120 he'd spent on seed and parts and fuel. Last year, with full synthetic fertilizer, he'd netted $1,120. He'd lost $180 compared to that, but last year he'd spent $312 on ammonia. This year he'd spent nothing, And if he'd gone to the bank for that 312 at 18% interest, he'd owe 368 by January. Net gain over the debt scenario, $132. Kenneth started the truck and drove home. The mountains on either side of the road showed their autumn colors, red and orange and yellow against evergreen. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only came in November, deep and cold and infinite. $132 wasn't much, wouldn't impress anyone, wouldn't change his life or solve his problems or make next year easier, but it was his, earned without debt, without owing any man anything, without signing papers that would follow him into winter and compound into spring. Pride has a price. So does shame. Kenneth had chosen pride. When he got home, Margaret was in the kitchen starting supper. She looked up when he entered. "How'd it go?" He set the check on the table between them. She picked it up, read the amount, set it back down. "Is that good?" "It's enough." She nodded once and returned to the stove. No questions about whether they could have done better. No regrets about the choice they'd made. Just acceptance that this was what they had and they'd make it work the way they always had. That evening, Kenneth sat on the porch, watching darkness settle into the hollow. Jacob came out and sat in the other chair, the one that had been George Harper's. "Mr. Dillard give you a fair price." "Fair enough. 3 cents below average, but he paid for clean leaf." "Is that good?" Kenneth thought about all the ways to answer that question, all the qualifications and explanations and justifications he could offer. Decided on simplicity. "It means we don't owe anybody anything. That's good enough for me." Jacob was quiet for a while. "Then I'm glad we did it this way." Kenneth looked at his son. 17 years old and already understanding things Kenneth hadn't learned until he was twice that age. That some victories looked small from the outside but felt large when you lived them. That independence had a value that couldn't be measured in dollars alone. The spring of 1985 brought Kenneth back to the field with renewed determination. He'd proven the concept worked. Now he needed to make it work better. He planted a heavier stand of red clover along every fence row, and in the north corner, where the slope made row cropping difficult anyway. Put down hairy vetch in early April as a cover crop, letting it grow thick before mowing and spreading it across the field. The case cultivator ran 4 times instead of twice, working the soil deeper with each pass, incorporating more organic matter, letting the biology of the ground do what it had been doing since before men figured out how to put things in bags and sell them. Agent Thornton came out again in May, walking the field with Kenneth and taking more soil samples. The results came back in June, showing organic matter content had climbed another 0.5%. The mineralization rate was increasing. The slow transformation Kenneth had started was continuing. "You're building something here." Thornton tapped the lab results with his pen. "Most farmers don't think past the current season. You're thinking 3, 4, 5 years out. Don't have much choice. Can't afford the fast way." Thornton smiled slightly. "Maybe that's the only reason anyone ever tries the hard way, because they can't afford the easy one." The 1985 crop came in stronger than 1984. The color was deeper, the weight was up. Kenneth walked the rows in August, seeing plants that looked healthier than the year before, leaves that held light differently, a vigor that came from soil that was genuinely improving, rather than being artificially boosted. At harvest, Mr. Dillard walked Kenneth's lot with the same deliberate patience as always. But this time, when he finished his inspection, something had changed in his expression. "Better than last year?" Kenneth nodded. "Soil's getting better. Color's definitely deeper. Weight's up, too." Dillard did his calculations and looked up. 84 cents a pound, county average. Kenneth had come back to par. The check he walked out with was just over $1,100, roughly where he'd been 2 years ago, except now he had no debt, a rebuilt cultivator, and soil that Agent Thornton said was measurably improving. The slow way was working. It was just slow. October 1985 brought Donald Carson back to Kenneth's farm. He didn't call ahead, just drove up one afternoon when Kenneth was working on the Oliver's carburetor, parked the Silverado, and got out. Kenneth set down his wrench and waited. "I heard your crop came in good. Good enough." Donald walked closer, hands in his pockets. "I heard you're still not buying ammonia." "Nope." There was a long silence. Donald looked at the ground, looked at the barn, looked back at Kenneth. "How's the cultivator working?" Kenneth wiped his hands on a rag. "Come look at it." They walked to the barn together. Kenneth showed him the case, cleaned and maintained. Now the shanks oiled the replacement sweeps, still holding their edge. Donald walked around it slowly, crouched down to examine the hitch pin assembly, stood up and was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather had one of these. Threw it out in '62. Should have kept it." Donald nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant accepting something that cost him to admit. "Yeah, probably should have." They stood in the barn without talking, and the silence held more honesty than any conversation they'd had in 30 years. Finally, Donald spoke again. "Kenneth, I'm carrying $42,000 in operating debt right now. That's what it costs me to farm 200 acres the modern way. Interest alone is $7,500 a year. $7,500 before I make a single dollar for myself." He turned to face Kenneth directly. "You're going to tell me I'm doing it wrong." Kenneth shook his head. "I'm not telling you anything. You farm your way. I'll farm mine. But you think I'm doing it wrong." Kenneth considered his answer carefully. What he thought was that Donald had built a prison out of convenience, that the easy way had turned into a trap, that bigger wasn't better when bigger required borrowing so much that you spent your whole life working for the bank instead of yourself. But saying that out loud would be cruelty disguised as honesty. "I think you're farming the way that made sense when you started. Whether it still makes sense now is something you'll have to decide." Donald was quiet for a while. Then he sat down on a hay bale, a man settling in for a conversation he'd been avoiding. "I came to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. All right, could I do what you're doing? Scale back the chemicals, run part of my operation organic, pay down the debt while the soil rebuilds?" Kenneth sat down across from him. Honest answer. You're in deeper than I ever was. You've got equipment payments, land payments, operating loans. Your whole setup is built around high-input, high-yield farming. Pulling back from that means accepting lower yields for 3, 4, maybe 5 years while the soil transitions. Can you afford that and still make your payments? Donald rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know. Maybe not. Then maybe you can't do what I'm doing. Not all at once, anyway. But you think I should try." Kenneth stood up, walked to the barn door, looked out at his own 11 acres. Small compared to Donald's 200, modest in every way except the one that mattered most. What I think is that debt makes slaves of free men. I watched it happen to people I cared about. I decided it wasn't going to happen to me, but I had the luxury of being small enough to make that choice. You're bigger. That gives you advantages I don't have, but it also gives you obligations I'll never face. Donald stood up and came to stand beside him. "You ever regret staying small? Every time I can't afford something I need. Every time I have to patch instead of replace. Every time Margaret comes home tired from the Piggly Wiggly because my farming can't quite cover all our expenses." He turned to look at Donald. "But I don't regret being free. And I sleep at night, knowing that if everything went wrong tomorrow, nobody could take this land from me. Can you say the same?" Donald was quiet for a long time. Finally, he held out his hand. "Thank you for being honest." Kenneth shook it. "You're welcome here any time." After Donald left, Jacob came to the barn. He'd been in the machine shed and had clearly heard most of the conversation. "Is Mr. Carson in trouble? Deep enough to be worried about it? Because he borrowed too much. Because he built a system that requires borrowing, and now he can't afford to stop." Jacob was quiet, processing that. Then, "We won't ever do that, will we? Not if I can help it." By 1987, Kenneth's soil had organic matter content higher than any comparable bottomland field in his part of the county. Agent Thornton brought a soil scientist out from Lexington that spring, not to study Kenneth specifically, but to study the region. When the results from Kenneth's 11 acres came back, they surprised people in offices who'd never met him. Thornton showed Kenneth the data on a visit in June. "Your mineralization rate is close to what you'd get from moderate synthetic application, and it's all coming from biological processes, from the clover and vetch and cultivation." Kenneth studied the graphs and numbers. "Does that mean I'm done? Soil's as good as it's going to get?" "No. It means you've crossed a threshold. The soil is now productive enough to sustain itself. Each year of this management will make it better. You've built a system that works with biology instead of chemistry." The scientist paused, choosing his words carefully. "Most farmers never build this. They rely on inputs they have to purchase every year. You've created something self-sustaining. That's rare." Kenneth's yields that year confirmed it. The crop came in strong plants taller than they'd been in 1985, leaves darker and more vigorous, overall tonnage approaching what he'd gotten in years when he'd used full synthetic fertilizer. Mr. Dillard walked the lot in November and paid 85 cents a pound, 1 cent above county average. Kenneth netted $1,200, more than he'd made in the last 4 years, more than he'd thought possible when he'd started this experiment 3.5 years ago with a rusted cultivator and a bill he couldn't pay. The cultivator itself had cost him approximately $90 total, $37 for sweeps, $8 for welding, $45 for miscellaneous parts and supplies. $90 to resurrect a machine that had been sitting in his barn for 23 years. That machine was still working, would probably still be working 23 years from now if someone maintained it properly. Just like the knowledge George Harper had passed down, just like the patience Margaret had shown, just like the faith that what looked impossible in April of 1984 might become possible if Kenneth just kept working at it one season at a time. Makes you wonder how many solutions are already sitting in your garage, your attic, your memory, just waiting for you to see them differently. Kenneth never asked himself that question in those exact words, but he lived the answer every day, in the way he approached problems, in the way he taught Jacob to look at challenges not as obstacles requiring new purchases, but as puzzles requiring creative use of what already existed. The years passed. Kenneth kept farming the same 11 acres, kept running the case cultivator every spring, kept planting clover and vetch and trusting biological processes over chemical ones. His yields remained consistent, not spectacular, never winning any county competitions, but steady and reliable, and produced without debt. Jacob stayed on the farm, worked beside his father through his 20s, learned everything Kenneth could teach him, and some things Kenneth hadn't known he knew until he had to explain them. By the time Jacob turned 30, he was doing most of the physical work while Kenneth handled planning and management. In 2014, Kenneth turned 73. His back had finally given up on the kind of labor farming required, and he'd transitioned to full retirement. Jacob was 47 now, running the operation with his own sons, helping some years. The 11 acres produced tobacco as consistently as they had for the past 30 years, fed by soil that kept improving year after year. The case cultivator sat in the barn, maintained and functional. Jacob had replaced the main bar properly around 2001, when the original crack had finally expanded beyond the weld Edward Caldwell had done. He'd fabricated 2 new shanks to replace ones that had worn beyond usefulness, had put on a new set of sweeps, but the implement remained fundamentally the same machine Kenneth had resurrected in 1984, 67 years old, now counting from its manufacture date, still doing the work it had been designed for. Jacob didn't use synthetic fertilizer, not because it was expensive, though it was, not because he couldn't afford it, though that remained true most years, but because the soil didn't need it anymore. Decades of organic management had transformed those 11 acres into something self-sustaining. The ground fed itself if you worked it right, just like George Harper had known, just like Kenneth had remembered. Young farmers came sometimes asking questions. How do you make the numbers work without chemicals? How do you compete against operations running thousands of acres with equipment that cost more than small houses? Jacob told them about his father, about the bill for $312 in April of 1984, about the choice that wasn't really a choice because the other option was debt, about the old case cultivator that had been sitting in the back of the barn since his grandfather's time. The thing about my dad is he never panicked. He just went looking for what was already there. And that's what kept coming back, not just to Jacob, but to anyone who knew the story. Kenneth Harper had never invented anything, never innovated or disrupted or optimized in any of the ways modern business valued. He'd simply remembered, trusted something slower than he would have liked, did the work with his own hands and his son's hands, and a machine built in 1947 that asked nothing from him except that he keep it clean and sharp and moving. The hardest skill in farming, maybe the hardest skill in any real work, is the faith that what you do today will matter in a season or two when you can't see results yet. When the crop comes in lighter than you wanted and the buyer gives you a polite nod and you drive home with a check that's less than you'd hoped. It takes something to believe you're building towards something, that the ground is improving, that what you're doing is right even when it doesn't look right yet. Kenneth had that faith, had inherited it the way he'd inherited the land, not through any legal deed or formal act, but through the accumulated weight of watching his father work. Half listening to things George said in late afternoons on porches when he wasn't trying to teach anything, just talking. Society throws things away so quickly now. Decides something is obsolete because it's old, because something newer exists, because the shiny solution at the co-op is right there and all you have to do is sign. Meanwhile, in the back of the barn, under hay bales, holding up the lantern hook, something waits. Not dramatically, not urgently, just sitting there in the dark, patient as iron, waiting for the day you finally needed enough to pay attention. Kenneth had needed it enough on April 14th, 1984. He'd pulled back the tarp, picked up his wrench, got to work. 30 years later, Jacob was still pulling that same cultivator through the same bottomland soil, the tines biting down into ground that kept getting better and better, one slow season at a time, the way things that last are always built, not fast, not cheap, not borrowed, but earned quietly with your own two hands. Kenneth sat on his porch these days watching Jacob work the field. Watched the Oliver 550 pull the case cultivator in the same pattern Kenneth had pulled it for 3 decades. Watched his grandsons learning the same lessons he'd learned, the same lessons George had known, that the ground was a partner, not a resource to be exploited, that patience compounded better than interest, that what you owned free and clear was worth more than what you financed to impress neighbors, that the old ways weren't old because they stopped working, they were old because people forgot them in favor of convenience. Margaret brought him coffee one morning while he sat watching the field. She was 70 now, her auburn hair gone completely gray, but her hands were still strong, and her eyes still held that steady certainty that had carried them through 48 years of marriage. She sat in the other chair, George's chair, and they watched Jacob work in comfortable silence. "You did good," she said finally. "We did good." She smiled. "All right, we did good." The coffee steamed in the morning air. The sun climbed higher. Jacob finished one pass and turned the tractor for another. The cultivator followed its shanks doing their work, breaking compaction, aerating soil, preparing ground for another season. Kenneth thought about the check he'd received in November 1984, $940, the disappointment he'd felt seeing that number, the calculation he'd done showing that despite the low yield, he'd still come out ahead of debt. That was the moment. Not the moment he'd found the cultivator in the barn, or the moment he'd decided not to go to the bank, but the moment he'd held that check and realized that success didn't always look like winning. Sometimes it looked like surviving. Sometimes it looked like $132 gained instead of $368 owed. Sometimes success looked like still being on your land 30 years later. Still farming, still free. Margaret stood up to go back inside. Paused at the door. "Agent Thornton called yesterday. Wants to bring some students out next month. Show them what long-term organic management looks like." Kenneth nodded. "That's fine. He wants to interview you for some kind of case study. What should I tell him? Tell him the truth, that we didn't know if it would work. We just knew we couldn't afford the alternative." She went inside. Kenneth stayed on the porch. Ever brought back something everyone said was useless? An old tool, an old skill, or even an old relationship? Or watched someone you know struggle under debt they never should have taken? Kenneth had lived both sides of that question, had brought back the useless cultivator, had watched Donald Carson struggle with debt that looked like success from the outside, but felt like drowning from the inside. The choice between those two paths had defined Kenneth's life, had shaped his son's futures, had proven that sometimes the hard way was the only way that led somewhere worth going. The sun climbed higher. The field work continued. And Kenneth Harper, 73 years old, third-generation white tobacco farmer in Harlan County, Kentucky, sat on his porch watching his legacy grow in real time. Not measured in acres or dollars or equipment value, but measured in soil that improved year after year, in knowledge passed from father to son to grandson, in a cultivator that had waited 23 years to be needed and had responded by working faithfully for 30 more. In freedom, in independence, in the stubborn insistence that what everyone else considered obsolete might actually be the most valuable thing you own if you just remember to look for it.